as a reaction to what they had seen happening in France. And anything that looked French or even smelled French was suspicious because it could lead to this kind of thing. And this had some serious impact on science. Here's one example now. The great astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace. This is another one of those legends, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. It's fun. Supposedly presented this model of the solar system to Emperor Napoleon, demonstrating how the solar system and the universe work like clockwork, according to this mathematical, very determined system with natural laws controlling everything. And supposedly, according to legend, Napoleon said, "I don't see any place for God in your system. There's no room left there for God to do anything, to act." And supposedly Laplace said, "My lord, I have no need of that hypothesis." Oh, what a shocking thing for a scientist to say to the emperor. He could explain nation's background. So I'm sure it's absolutely not true, but the fact that stories like this, legends like this, keep going, does tell you something about the people at the time. You will remember, of course, Lamarck, who was also living through all of these events. Worked for the, after the revolution, the royal gardens became national ones. And so it used to be royal patronage used to fund science. Now they had state institutionally funded science. Britain did not have it. We had basically rich men like Darwin and Lyell and a few people in the university doing science. So Lamarck's theory, which I told you before was bashed to death by Cuvier, who was the top dog of French science. One of the implications of this, not only did Cuvier make Lamarck's evolutionary theory look silly and stupid, but across the channel, because it was French, it was even more suspicious. And the association was made that evolutionary theories were socially and morally dangerous. That's part of the reason why there were such strong objections to theories of evolution in the English-speaking world. And so when Mr. Vestiges came out with his book, that was such a bashing, because people had all of this in the back of their minds. We know where such things could go. If we accept theories like this, it would be guillotined in Piccadilly in a couple of years. That was how bad they got it. Oh, yes, here's another representation of these crazy French radicals, as they were seen in the UK. Now, let me use this background to put Paley and his argument from design in context. I told you before that Paley and his famous watch analogy, his so-called argument from design, was not new, though every textbook will tell you that it's his idea or his argument. It's very old, like earlier thinkers and beyond them. But that everywhere else in Europe, this was considered so old-fashioned, it wasn't published anymore. But in Britain, it hung on for decades. And it has something to do with this reactionary movement against all of the secular radical, ideologies that were associated with the French Revolution. Anti-moral, anti-social, anti the upper classes. So this, what was everywhere else in Europe considered to be an old-fashioned and outmoded argument, retained a sort of sheen of respectability, or more than a sheen, but it remained respectable in Britain, and was taught in Cambridge for many decades, many decades. So, I have mentioned a few times the Bridgewater treatises, which were funded by the, not the will, but the bequest of the Earl of Bridgewater after he died, to have the sort of the argument of Paley about the wisdom and goodness of God being evident in nature, updated by the top scientific men of the age. So this was the books that came out of this series. I've shown you the one from Buckland several times with this lovely map. Okay. So you see, in Britain, what was really a very old-fashioned model, old-fashioned philosophy, hung on much later than everywhere else. But of course, influences, books, and so forth from the continent are constantly coming over, influencing people, like the Marx theory, which probably influenced Mr. Vestas. Now we're going to talk about this man, Charles Babbage. You probably haven't heard of, but if you have, maybe if you take computing, you might have heard of him. He's often referred to as the inventor of the computer. Don't get hung up on these things names about any inventor of the first of anything. But he did design and partly construct the world's first programmable mechanical computer. They didn't call it a computer, because by the way, in those days, a computer was a person. And what do you do? I'm a computer. You wrote tables. That was what a computer was originally, a person. Anyway, it was very laborious and had various reasons why they had to make large tables of numbers which required calculations. It's very tedious. And then, of course, you had somebody else check all of them. So it took double the time. So Babbage had this brilliant, Babbage was a genius. He was incredibly intelligent. And he had the idea that a machine could be created that could generate the calculations with mechanical power instead of brain power. And he was another one of these gentleman naturalists like Darwin. He lived in London. He used to have weekly soirees at his house where all the scientific bigwigs and other socialites would gather. And he would talk about this picture on the bottom right is a modern reconstruction of Babbage's computer. He never actually completed it, despite getting bags and bags of government funding. It never really finished. But recently it has been constructed, I think in the Science Museum, I'm not sure where, anyway, in London, and it works. So anyway, Babbage used this to put forward one of his own sort of naturalistic arguments. So here's the Victorian naturalist coming in at first background. He had a working model, a small version of this machine, with a handle on the side. That's how you power it. No lecturing like this. And he would crank it, and the numbers along the dials there would read a sequence of numbers. So let's say it said 100. And you turn the crank, and then it would say 110. You do it again, 120, 130, 140. Do this over and over again before his guests. And he would say, okay, if I do it one more time, what will it be? And of course, everyone says, well, it would be an increment of 10 more than what you did before. You'd say, okay, you turn the handle again, and there'd be some completely different number. And then they would all say, well, you were fooled by this because based simply on what you observed, you assumed what would happen next would be what you had always observed. So you assumed that you had found the law that explains the behavior of my device. It's like finding the law of nature. You had found a regularity. But now something has apparently broken that law. Is it a miracle? And he argued, no, it's not a miracle because I programmed it to behave in this way, that it would go up in these increments of 10 until after so many cycles in which it would jump to some other integer. So in other words, he argued that what might look like something that breaks the laws of nature, something that might look like a miracle, could in fact actually be a law of nature that you did not completely understand. So this was Babbage's clever argument to, as we've seen so many times, do this one-upmanship to get laws of nature on top and to displace the role of divine intervention in naturalistic explanations of things. Mr. Vestiges loved this argument, and he quotes it at length in Vestiges, which no doubt probably embarrassed Mr. Babbage. Babbage and Darwin were friends, by the way. He went to some of these soirees too. Okay, here's another one. John Pringle Nichol. He was a prominent astronomer, and he wrote this very, very popular book called Views of the Architecture of the Heavens. And he used the science of Laplace and earlier astronomers to argue something that also went into Vestiges, which is that they were starting to see these things in in outer space with the latest telescopes that they called nebula. They look like swirling spirals out in space. And Nicol used what was called the nebular hypothesis, the hypothesis of nebula, which is that solar systems form gradually by the natural actions of gravity and so forth. These nebula of gas and dust, rubbish, gradually spinning and then accumulating into planets, and the center of sun forms. And so that a solar system, basically an entire world, could be created by naturalistic means. This was, I mean, to us, this is so old-fashioned, it's not radical. But to Victorians, this was hot stuff. Wow, you could create entire worlds just with the laws of nature if these observations were correct. So Mr. Vester just put this at the front of his book, because he had everything in nature gradually evolving, starting with solar systems. Okay, here's another character. This one is not British, he's German. Franz Josef Gall, up there on the left. He was the creator of what came to be known as phrenology. I talked about phrenology in the lecture on Wallace in Leicester. Gall was an Enlightenment figure who created his own philosophy of the mind, the human mind, and the human brain. He argued that the mind, some immaterial thing floating around out here, can only interact with your body through physical organs. And that there must be one physical organ to correspond with each faculty or part of the mind. And eventually he concluded that there were 27 of these, that the mind is composed of 27 parts or faculties. And therefore the brain is also. The organ in the brain was bigger or smaller, and that part of the mind would be more or less active. And he discovered a lot of these through, not very, we would nowadays call it not very good science. And he would have a patient in a mental hospital who displayed some kind of bizarre behavior, and when the patient died, he'd dissect his brain and find some funny nodule in his brain and say, aha, this is what was wrong with this patient, so whatever that part of his behavior that was wrong, that part of the mind must be in that part of the brain. We did actually get one of them correct, which was there was a patient in this island who lost the ability to speak. And he later dissected his brain and did indeed locate the area we now know where language is. Broca's region, that's not there. Anyway, so he got one right now, the others wrong. One of my favorites is he had a female patient, Dr. Seven. Very interesting job in those days. You could be alone with the lady in the room, so that was not something you could otherwise do. And she was having some sort of passionate fit and fainted or swooned in front of Dr. Gall, who caught her as she fell and felt that as he laid down on the sofa, found that the back of her head was really hot. And so he deduced that the organ for sexual passion was located right here. Everybody have a good feel right there. Is it nice and round? Not. Well, it's up to you. Anyway, so by such means he mapped out the entire head with all these different zones. And he went on a fabulously successful lecture all over Europe. This is during the time of Napoleon, around 1805, 1806. Here's a drawing of him giving one of his lectures. All the big people of Europe went to see him. He was extremely popular. Although he didn't really make any progress. This is the kind of people who went to his lectures published a lot of booklets about his new doctrine, his new system. This is one of them, a German book. He had only one disciple, really, his assistant, another doctor, Johann Gaspar Spurzheim, a young German physician. He was basically Gall's assistant, and eventually the two of them end up in Paris, and the lecture tour ended, and Gall settled down and started to publish, and Spurzheim got a bit dissatisfied with being in the shadow of his famous boss, and eventually broke away and went to Britain. And he brought the doctrine with him. But he was a very ambitious man, had lots of his own ideas, really changed it. Added lots of new organs to the brain, all sorts of other aspects to the philosophy, and so published this book in London in 1815. physiognomical system of Dr. Scholar's brother. So he used the name of his famous boss on the title page before his own. And so there's the system with your head identified and so on. But he didn't do quite so well in Britain as Gall had done. He was widely ridiculed as a charlatan and a kook. He was a bit odd man, actually. So very soon there were all sorts of caricatures making fun of him, like this one, where some lady has taken off her wig and has a bizarre shape on her head. And she's asking to have her poodle's head read after her. Here's another one. Note the bumps on the head of the lecturer. They just couldn't stop making fun of this doctrine as bumpology. So he's got bumpy heads, and half of his audience has bumpy heads. But he did something that Gall didn't. He made lots and lots of converts everywhere he went. He stayed in London, Edinburgh, he went to Ireland, and he converted people to this new doctrine of bump reading. And along with it went another one of these philosophies of nature and natural laws. It was part of the way he started his online papers with him. Excellent law. So that's not much good time. Poor man. He was a very serious German. He hated being ridiculed, but he was very wise individual. By the way, phrenology lasted until that's the beginning of the 20th century. It died out. It's extinct now. But I like this photograph here. Phrenology step in, right under the sign. See on the right? She speaks several languages instead of she speaks several languages. Well, she obviously doesn't speak English very well. So, this is what phrenology had declined to by the end of the 20th century. It was a ridiculous joke that was just taught by charlatans. But in the early 19th century, what we're talking about, it was semi-respectable to some people. So this is Spurzheim's big convert. He was an Edinburgh lawyer named George Combe, another very dour Scot, took himself very seriously and took the science of phrenology very seriously and was convinced that it was the most important discovery in the history of the world and that it held the secrets to everything. Better life, fixing up the economy, you name it, phrenology can fix it. Do it. Plus, he took on board, more than anything, Spurzheim's natural philosophy, which Kuhn then built up on his own to become a sort of almost a religion of natural laws. I don't know if any of you will recognize these. This is the kind of phrenology bust that then began to be produced in Britain back in Gall's day. They just had these skulls. These glossy things that you see nowadays come from British Christianity. Anyway, so Kuhn published lots of books on phrenology, so he gave lectures, but he then published a book that was far more radical. And many people mistakenly, because he's only a phrenologist, he's not known for anything else. That's Kuhn here. But he published a book that became one of the best sellers of the 19th century, which is a big deal. And it was this: the constitution of man considered in relation to external objects. And this is constantly referred to by many writers as a book on phrenology by that phrenologist, George Kuhn. Well, it has a chapter on phrenology in it, because he was a pretty rabid, only an phrenologist, and he was a bit nuts. But this book is not about phrenology. The title page says it's about the constitution of man, the makeup of humanity. And the book is about a philosophy of natural laws that run everything. And he divided them into three kinds: physical, organic, and moral. You will see that kind of language then in thousands of other books and pamphlets throughout the Victorian period, even in Wallace's writing. This is one of Wallace's favorite books when he was your age, when he was, before he went on an expedition. So Kuhn argued that if you were ignorant of the laws of nature, right, then you would suffer punishment, not by God, but by nature. So, such as catching a cold. he used an argument to demonstrate that, again, this is this one-upmanship with laws of nature versus God of nature. So he argued that, imagine you have a ship full of really nasty, bad people, horrible pirates, villains, and rapists. Just the worst possible people you can imagine. They're terrible, pure evil. Okay, and they sailing on a ship in the ocean, but the people, but they observe the laws of nature in the sense that they maintain the ship, keep it seaworthy, and so forth. They will sail safely across the sea, and no harm will come to them. Now imagine another ship full of the most moral, pious, religious, good, pure, virtuous people, right? But they don't carefully observe the laws of nature, so their ship is not well maintained, they've lost a bit leaky. They also sail off from the sea, it springs a leak, they sink, and they all fall in the ocean and drown, and die. Kuhn says, you see, in the real world, it's not whether or not you are good and moral that counts, but whether or not you observe the laws of nature. In other words, his doctrine, his philosophy that he's pushing in this book is superior, is more important. This really angered his contemporaries. Especially there was a very strong evangelical movement in Edinburgh where he lived, and many of them were members of his phrenological society. And basically, he and they were tussling to see who would control the phrenological movement, the evangelicals or Kuhn, his naturalistic philosopher. And basically, they got so fed up with him and his insults that they stormed out of the phrenological society and left it to him and his followers. So this book became, yeah. Yes, so this book was far more controversial and hated and loathed than even Darwin's Origin of Species. Much closer with the reaction to vestiges, which I've already talked about. But even more, this is even more opposed probably than vestiges, because it was about 15 years before. This was the first one of these radically naturalistic books that basically, although he was not openly anti-religious and talked about the Creator many times in this book, it was absolutely obvious that he was saying, you don't have to worry about that stuff. It's a learning about nature and following the natural laws of his philosophy of natural laws. That was what would lead to the good life. That's what you need to pay attention to be good. This is very offensive to his religious opponents. No, you don't have to follow that. You have to follow Christianity, follow its rules. That's what you need the good life. So societies were founded just to oppose this book. Can you imagine joining a club to oppose a book because it was so awful? But it was selling such massive numbers that people were afraid it was corrupting the youth. It was corrupting the country and the country's morals. This is one pamphlet I found in which you can see on the bottom right there, Kuhn on the Constitution of Man, as well as some phrenology stuff, roasting in hellfire. And in at least one instance in Scotland, Kuhn's book was publicly burned. Now this did not happen to vestiges, and it would have been totally unthinkable by the time Darwin's Origin of Species was published decades later. This is 1828. Darwin's book was published in 59. So it was the last time I think the books was, or one of the last times they were. So in this chart, you can see a comparison between the sales of Constitution of Man, which is the one at the top, massive seller, and Vestiges, which is the second one, starting there, and then the dark one at the end is Origin of Species. Origin of Species never even got close to the numbers that. So this obscure, now very totally forgotten and obscure man, George Kuhn, with his funny bombology, actually influenced hundreds of thousands of people. Well, they didn't take on board all of his philosophy, but they took on plenty of it. As you can see from this quotation from an obituary for the Illustrated News. This is about his book. No book published within the memory of man, in the English or any other language, has effected so great a revolution in the previously received opinions of society and the Constitution of Man. The influence of that unpretending treatise has extended to hundreds of thousands of minds, which know not whence they derived the new light that has broken in upon them, and percolated into thousands of circles that are scarcely conscious of knowing more about Mr. Kuhn than his name and that he was a phenologist. Sorry. Now, what the writer here means by that his influence is extended to many minds who don't even know it, he's referring to the fact that not only did many people buy Kuhn's book and read it, but it was so influential that hundreds of other books and pamphlets were written by people who had read Kuhn and taken on board a lot of his philosophy. And so by that means, this Kuhn's version of naturalism spread very widely from book after book after book. So there are thousands of books written in this period which are strongly influenced, or that their philosophy of nature, natural laws, traces its way back ultimately to Kuhn. You can often identify that with that tripartite way of talking about natural laws, but we have that kind of the physical, organic, and moral. But that particular thing, for example, is very widely repeated. And it's very, you can recognize that as the source. This comes ultimately from Kuhn in his book. Even though, as the writer of this says, the person using the phrase might actually know where it originally came from. So it's very, very widely influential. Particularly with our friend Mr. Vestiges. Here he is actually in the top right. That's Robert Chambers, an Edinburgh publisher, and a friend of George Kuhn's. They knew each other. And Chambers was also a phrenologist. He loved Kuhn's book. He was one of the big followers. So Vestiges, which I've told you a little bit about, is like a direct descendant of Kuhn's Constitution of Man. Although Kuhn himself was not an evolutionist, as far as we know, he doesn't seem to have been interested in evolution, and he may not have accepted it. But anyway, the direct progeny of his philosophy of nature and natural laws was Vestiges. It's dripping with Constitution's philosophy. But Kuhn has forgotten people generally now just look at Vestiges and think it all comes from him. Well, here's a little Victorian cartoon showing people, I told you that people were kicking this book around. Here they are literally kicking Vestiges around because nobody wants it. So, disliked. Okay, next, a different topic, biblical scholarship. This is a major part of the background, or the context, to this so-called Victorian naturalism. And I'll talk about this. Did I show you this slide before? No. Okay. Because this slide, I think, appears in 2 lectures. Okay. But it will come back again in the lecture on Darwin religion. Okay. So, this is an important part of the background to what's happening in Britain, the world that Darwin and Wallace live in. Starting back in the 18th century, which is to say the 1700s, particularly in Germany, there have been a growing movement of biblical scholarship. That is, scholars studying the books of the Bible as historical documents in order to learn more about them and so on. Particularly by finding the oldest surviving manuscripts. Because it's one thing to read an ancient book like Homer or Bible in English or in German, but that's not the original. That's a modern translation. They wanted to trace back how far they could get to the original. Well, the manuscripts that survived were not that old, maybe a few hundred years old, or maybe 1,000 years. But none of them went even close to the time of the events that they depict. But anyway, by studying these manuscripts, and by studying the texts themselves in a very serious and scholarly way, they discovered all sorts of things about the books. So it's often referred to as higher criticism. And yes, so there's some of the famous names are Schleiermacher, Strauss, and Feuerbach. You don't need to remember their names. But some of the basic things. Now these scholars, again, a bit like the early geologists who found out that the Earth was really old, they were all religious Christians. Similar with these early biblical scholars, they were trying to undermine the Bible in any but they found out things about it that hadn't been known before. Here's one example. The Christian New Testament is divided up into, well, lots of different books, but the Gospels are attributed to various people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, nobody had ever noticed before that the books themselves are actually anonymous and are not signed by anyone. And only in later centuries had later people attributed them to those names and written them at the top. But the writings themselves are absolutely anonymous. Never say who they are, because the writers never say who they are. Okay, well that was a new discovery. Maybe those attributions were correct, maybe they weren't, but that was something new that they found out. Similarly, they found that by studying the style of the original Greek, the New Testament was written originally entirely in Greek, not Latin, and not Hebrew, like the Old Testament. They found lots and lots of other things. That certain passages were clearly written by someone else because of a different writing style. That the documents don't claim to be by eyewitnesses. So none of them ever say, well, Jesus and I were walking along and then he said. They're all told in a more distant type of narrative of, this is what happened. But you're not told that the writer was there. And clearly the writer wasn't there. And then they found various inconsistencies. So, for example, the famous story of the woman caught in adultery. This story goes that some of Jesus' critics wanted to play a trick on him and catch him out by bringing to him a woman who had been caught in adultery. And according to the Jewish law, I think it was actually on the Sabbath as well. She'd been caught in adultery. According to Jewish law, she should be stoned to death. But Jesus was always preaching mercy and so forth. So they said, what do you say we do? And according to the story, Jesus thinks of a very clever answer, which is, he said, because if he says, be merciful, they'll say, you're breaking the law, you're a criminal. And if he says, yep, she broke the law, stoned her to death, they'll say, you're a hypocrite. Where's your mercy teaching now? So he thinks of a clever answer, which is, let he among you who has no sin cast the first stone. And they're all embarrassed, because they're all not very pure either. Eventually they all drift away, and the lady is left there with Jesus, and eventually says, where have your accusers gone? They're all gone. And he says, well, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. This is the story, okay? It's one of the most famous and popular stories. But these biblical scholars discovered that the passage had in fact been added to the book at a later date, because the earliest manuscripts of this, the early handwritten versions of this book, do not contain the story. And secondly, when they found later ones that did contain the story, it was obviously written in a different style of Greek. The person who wrote that part is not the person who had written the previous part of the book. So these are just examples of the kinds of things that these scholars were uncovering. Now, to some people, this was the grounds for skepticism, but only some. For many others, it simply was a way of reinterpreting their religion, and they just got on with it. Just like the geologists did when they found out the Earth was older than they thought, or that the flood of Noah must not apply to the whole Earth, but maybe just occurred to the region in which the people who wrote that lived in. Because after all, they only knew about a world around them that was 1,002 miles wide. They didn't know about the Americas. They didn't know about Australia, and so forth. So, reinterpretation. Anyway, this sort of biblical scholarship eventually percolated over into Britain, but it did so often in the guise of people who really were religious skeptics and secularists, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and George Eliot translated Strauss's Life of Jesus from 1846, which was very radical to many people, very unpleasant for many people, because it tried to tell the story of Jesus' life as just a historical person, rather than as a special religious leader, a special being. This was very, very unacceptable to many people. So this is radical stuff. But these things were now percolating into the UK and being widely read and discussed. By many people condemned and loathed, but by others were considered convincing or interesting, perhaps. Darwin eventually became aware of this literature too, and lots of other people, like Kuhn, like Mr. Vesalius, and so forth. And ultimately, this ends up in the booklet that I mentioned in the last lecture, Essays and Reviews, published in 1860, just after Darwin's Origin of Species, in which a group of clergymen from Oxford argued that it was essential that the Church of England should take on board the new discoveries of biblical scholarship. So they were arguing for a more, should we say, a more liberal, less literal version of Christianity and the Bible and so forth, which was fiercely resisted by more conservative elements in the church. That's why this book, Essays and Reviews, was far more controversial than Darwin's Origin of Species, even though in the world of science it was hugely controversial. But Essays and Reviews was, the whole country was in uproar over this kind of book, because it seemed like an attack on Christianity from inside the church itself, by clergymen. That was the way many people represented it. So to many people it seemed that these new scientific movements, first there was astronomy, and then there was geology, and now there was evolution, and then there was this biblical scholarship. All of these, to many conservative people, seem to be undermining traditional religion or traditional religious interpretations. And this forms the backdrop to what will take place in the latter half of the 19th century. Let's take your 5-minute break right now.
What is it undermining again?
Never really listen. It's like very hard to like.
Yeah,
focus
to
on. Like
but I know what
I'll
you
stay
mean.
right, yeah, but I won't listen. Then for you go toilet.
I was like,
For you. Later after lesson.
are you okay? Are you okay? Go.
Nah, let me see.
I know. It's not the cue story. Is that Sharif? Oh my god. That's good. Like, what? Oh, later.
His face. Fuck, I can recorded the look of his face.
Alright.
Like, actually, some can do tak live also. Happy birthday, then. Oh, sorry. Hey, mask. Why is your name wrongly? R. Your name got 2 R. Hi. He's the architect. You want Instagram it? It's a compound here. Fuck. Are you 24? Crazy. I feel like I've never matured my over the last few years. No, like damn sad. Like JC and NS like quite the graph like. I feel like uni never matures, you're fucked. Then so Connor never cheer up. Yeah, you're working for Red Bull now. Got a job.
Tomorrow, you know what you're planning to do? You're planning to do public speaking lecture. Right?
Yup.
Tomorrow, public speaking lecture. Then you prepared 144 pens. On the top you stick, crack the can open at 4:25. So everybody at 4:25 fully and then after I'm going to video the teacher's class. People with fucking prepare 144 pens today. I don't know why we do
Now, why public speaking?
just because and because public speaking, a lot of people from all different faculties. It's a jam. It's like doing this lecture.
You should
Public
do.
speaking is fun. Like, jump on the chill. Then like everybody just at the same time while it's speaking effectively. But yesterday we sit down and prepare
The 144. How? But the marketing one, not marketing, the section one good. Now you all put the Red Bull under the. It got video of the one in class you all cared at 4:35. See, like, got some people the clock different timing. Yeah, but nice. Now you're 144, if you hit half, good enough here.
more than
This is our class one, right? You want to take from another table?
pass around mostly the paper with
Angmo. Angmo sure power, you should focus on Angmo. They will create the most uproar. He shocked.
This made my day.
It's from our country.
Then the rest like
Fuck, reaction all these.
this is Angmo one.
Yeah, this made my day.
But look at this. All the ugly cans face sticker.
How y'all seal it? Is it sealed?
It's a close can then just a sticker.
No, I thought like there's another like layer of wrapper.
Oh,
Alright, take out wrapper.
there is the case.
Actually, first I after I ended,
How you put it back into the case?
Open up the video, then you just take out.
half an hour.
Actually, no need. Why you want to give it to them?
Yeah,
Just carry out.
Carry.
I felt very bad like Monday night. Help me take out. Next time I buy you, don't buy you anything. Yeah, I something funny. Today like really it's not good. So honestly, nobody like went to find out like which like the name of the person that invented discover certain theories. Then the first question of the MCQ, like which guy is the one that came up with this global saving theory. I just chose the name that is the most familiar to me. Then at the end of the whole thing, I told people my option, right? Then they were like, that guy is the author of the book. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense why his name is like so familiar. I think it could be wrong because like,
From this sort of thing. Now when you consider all of these other movements and philosophies and so forth that have been going on in previous decades, and at the same time, there's Darwin's book coming out now. I hope will not seem like such an isolated event happening in a vacuum, because it's not. It's happening in a world in which all these other things are bubbling around, being created and so forth. Okay? So, that's the world in which people live, in which this controversial scientific book comes out. One of the top men of science in the country arguing that living things change over time, that they evolve, and that where new things come from in the fossil record, why things are living in different parts of the world, and why these mockingbirds on different islands of Galapagos or whatever, is that they are actually descended from some earlier species, but that they changed over time. Fair enough. The implication that bothered most people about that, of course, was the implication about human beings. That human beings must also be gradually changed out of earlier things. And that a lot of people did not like, and they didn't want to accept because they felt it had terrible implications about human meaning, worth, morality, and so forth. Okay, so that brings us to another one of these big isms, like Victorian naturalism. This is one of the big parts of this story, which is what is sometimes called the Victorian crisis of faith. And if you read Victorian biographies or autobiographies, this is one of these famous things that supposedly happened to a lot of people, particularly a lot of intellectuals in Victorian Britain, that they had a crisis of faith, maybe based on Darwin, probably based on all these other things as well, Kuhn's naturalistic philosophy, or new geology, or vestiges, or biblical scholarship, or probably just some mixture of all of these things. That lots and lots of people underwent a crisis of faith. In other words, they began to doubt their religion. And this was very upsetting for most of these people. And so it became something that happened so frequently that we have so many accounts about it that it seems like something typical of the Victorian age. It didn't happen to everybody. Plenty of people underwent this sort of thing. And Darwin, I think we'll find later on, is not a good model for this in his own experience. Because look at the word crisis. This means you're really upset. You're in a crisis. Right? You don't want to give up on your faith, on your religion, on the religion of your family and friends and so forth. But many of these people were starting to doubt that maybe the Christianity that they had learned in school and in church and so forth, maybe it wasn't as well founded as they thought and so forth. So they went through all sorts of torturous self-reflection and so forth, trying to decide what they should do about this. Some of them veered away into more liberal versions of Christianity, and some of them evolved away into being non-religious altogether. So, in this context, in which religious views are, for many, or for some, are changing a lot, okay, at this time. And it's about this time that our old friend, Huxley, has become quite a scientific bigwig. He's a well-known man of science, and in all these gentlemen's clubs and intellectual debates and so forth, he is obviously known. People think that he's some kind of skeptic. He's clearly one of these hyper-liberal types. He's not someone who believes in the traditional Christianity of his homeland. But he's not an atheist either. We have to remember that in the 19th century and before that, there basically weren't any atheists, or there were very few. But the word atheist was about the worst word in the English language. I mean, it was basically meant someone who was pure evil. The most awful thing you could be, because an atheist was someone who was totally untrustworthy, because you cannot have a pact or agreement with someone who has no faith. They're faithless, and so forth. So it had all sorts of these bad attributes. So it was a term of abuse. No one called themselves an atheist.
Atheist.
There may have been some people who probably were, but they didn't tell anybody, or I don't know, they used some other word for it. Anyway, so sometimes some of these other well-to-do gentlemen of science might have asked Huxley at gentlemen's clubs and said, how would you describe your views? Well, he sure as heck wasn't going to say he was an atheist, because A, he wasn't, and B, you can't possibly use that word. It's like saying, I'm pure evil. You just can't. No one can describe himself that way. Huxley was a clever man. So he wanted to think of a word to describe his own point of view, but in the same way that we've seen with all these other isms, like Kuhn, who has his philosophy of natural laws, which he tries to elevate as being more important than Christianity. Huxley kind of does the same trick by coining the word agnostic, by which he means that he is unable to decide one way or the other whether or not God exists or not. So this is not just claiming that you are unable to decide, that you don't have the evidence or the information to enable you to make a decision, but it's another one of these exercises of intellectual one-upmanship. He's actually arguing that he's better than, it's a bit like the old phrase, a plague on both your houses. I'm better than both sides of that debate, because I'm so brilliant that I know that there isn't enough evidence to make a decision one way or another. So, that was what Huxley was doing. Clever chap, thinking that he's putting himself above the debate by coining this term agnostic, or agnosticism, which is the term still in use today, but it's been so long that maybe it's slightly evolved and maybe means something different to people nowadays. But that was the original meaning of the word agnosticism. And, it became very popular, I think for the reasons that I just outlined. A, it allowed you to say, I'm not religious, but also I'm not one of those nasty bad people either, which is obviously something that a lot of people wanted to do. So it was a sort of respectable label, a respectable way out for people living in this generation who had decided that they, after the crisis of faith or whatever, were going one way rather than another. So they would become agnostic, which was skeptical but respectable. That's the way I put it. That's the way they saw things. Huxley was also very much involved in what we nowadays historians call the professionalization of science. So throughout the period that I've been talking about in these lectures, almost all these men of science, all these naturalists, were gentlemen amateurs. They were usually people with enough money, like Darwin, to pursue scientific interests on their own, or perhaps like Wallace, they had to make a living through collecting. Perhaps he worked in a museum or maybe had a professorship, but it was mostly private. It was gentlemen amateurs, especially in Britain, where there was very little institutional and almost no governmental support. But as the middle of the century wore on, more and more people were pushing for a more professionalized science, in which it was, again, this is the same old one-upmanship again, actually. And Huxley was one of the main figures in this, in which they wanted to represent men of science as professionals, as something more serious and better than the old-fashioned, the older generation of gentlemen amateurs. And it will be just a couple of decades after this that this new word begins to be used, scientist, which, although the word was first coined by William Whewell in 1831, nobody used it. But it did come to be used in America at the end of the 19th century, and then came back to Britain. Huxley hated it. He said, oh, it was a vulgar Americanism, scientist. He didn't like it. He didn't want it to be used, but he lost, and it did come to be used. But that's why I try to be careful. I know I sometimes say it, but I try to be careful not to use the word scientist to talk about all the people we talked about in this lecture before. Because it's not just that they didn't have the word, but the idea was different of who they were, what they were. And Darwin was a gentleman naturalist. It's not the same as being a scientist. Now, you might think that, well, it's just an equivalent. Scientists, naturalists. There are lots of nuances. It's not the same. So they were trying to professionalize science. And of course, like almost everything that people do, it's really selfish. Huxley and his friends, of course, they were not rich men like Darwin and Lyell, who could just pursue their scientific interests for the rest of their lives because they had so much money. But Huxley was poor. He needed a paycheck. So he started out as a ship's naturalist, like Darwin, but he was actually a naval surgeon. And on his voyage on a ship called the Rattlesnake, they stopped in Australia, where he met a gorgeous Australian girl. Of course, they fell in love, and he was too poor to get married, so he had to sail home without her, living a very sort of engagement. And for years, he was trying to scratch together enough money to be able to bring her over and get married. And he was really grumpy at the fact that the scientific community was full of all these rich idiots who had their position by virtue of family wealth and so forth. They were top of scientific institutions. But Huxley and his sort of coterie of young contemporaries, they wanted to make science more professional. A, because it sounded good, it sounded modern, modernizing science and so forth. You need to make scientific positions, you have to have proper education and credentials. Scientific institutions need to be funded either by, hopefully by government, perhaps by industry, and this is how serious science will progress and science will become more modern and so forth. We'll leave those old-fashioned grandfathers early ages behind. So of course people always represent their needs in a way that sounds really good and modern and so forth. Yeah, I mean, that's probably all partly true. Let's not forget it's also selfish. In other words, they're promoting a new kind of science, which would be more professional, which would also mean paychecks for them. And it worked. So science did become more professional. People started wearing white lab coats, and Huxley got a nice job. Eventually, he had several jobs. Eventually, he would be glad to know he was able to bring on his Australian Navy.
Put away,
got married,
put back, then cannot call. Cannot call.
Now, another one of these characters in Huxley's sort of informal club was this man, John Tyndall.
Because I told him.
He was the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science one year. Remember, in
I got no
1860,
collection.
same society had met, and that's where Wilberforce and Huxley had their legendary
Really zero recollection.
confrontation. You remember between grandmothers?
Not down. Oh no.
Anyway, same scientific society, this time meeting in Ireland,
You want to stay
and Tyndall
it's not a good idea.
is now one of the more radical
Which is why I want to
types
sell. That's
on
why
this,
I don't know why I
on
want
the
to sell.
secular side of this
Because I still
Victorian
want to stay.
naturalism that I've been talking about.
Then after that, just leave me say don't. Like turn the same thing.
He was,
After I just sell.
I'm not sure if he called himself an agnostic. In fact, I don't believe he ever did call himself an agnostic. But he was some kind of
This guy
skeptic.
made me lose interest.
And he gave this, it's called the Belfast Address. He gave a presidential address to the opening of the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and his lecture, which was published as Panel in Baylor, was massively controversial.
For him.
He angered a lot of people, particularly all of the religious people in the audience in Belfast, who were much more conservative than most of the
How long is
clergy
Africa?
were in England.
I can shorten this damn easy.
But this sort of stuff should
I
sound
expanded.
familiar to you, because you know some of the sources where his
You ask
all
Eugene to
come
ask
from.
I don't know
He
behind
argued for
longer.
the sufficiency of natural laws to run everything in nature. He doesn't say God probably doesn't exist. God doesn't have any role in nature. But it's so strongly implied that a lot of people were really offended. And properties of nature, he said, nature itself do all that we observe. There's no room for God, which is exactly what some of those radical French revolutionaries had said over 70 years before, 90 years before. So what it would have been considered the most evil and dangerous thing you could say
composed.
in Britain in the
Essay.
1790s or the very beginning of the 19th century. Here is a well-connected, respectable, supposedly, British naturalist
After this, I could have be right.
saying exactly those things at a very public venue. Things had gone full turn. This is exactly the opposite of the respectable sort of thing that William Paley taught, which is natural theology. Tyndall's ideology was extremely radical.
Tinder.
And
Dude, this guy
he wrote that
Tinder.
religious sentiment should not be permitted to intrude on the region of knowledge over which it holds no command. In other words, he said religion should keep its nose out of science, because it has no role, no place, no power here. This was not only very radical, but considering the audience that he was speaking to was very rude. It was very aggressive. So it was a hugely controversial speech, widely debated, but in the end, Tyndall actually came across better than you might think. Usually people come across as too aggressive and so forth. They don't look good. But he actually didn't do so bad. But many people thought that he was a pantheist based on his remarks. Do you know what a pantheist is? A pantheist is, well, you can break it apart into its two roots, right? Pan-theist. Everything theist. Everything God. That's what it means. A pantheist is someone who thinks that God and nature are basically the same thing. So this particular thinker, his version of things was basically to take all this scientific naturalism, all these philosophies of natural laws running everything and so forth. He took that all on board so much that there was no room left for the traditional view of God at all, as a personal God who you can pray to, who does things, who thinks things. For people like Tyndall, there weren't that many of them. Nature had basically taken over everything that other people said God was, or that God did. So for Tyndall, there's just nature. And when people talk about God, or miracles, or something like that, creator or creation, they're just talking about nature and what nature does. There's nothing else that exists but nature. That was his sort of view. It was not popular. It was very radical. But at the same time, you see, this is not atheism, which, as I said, was very taboo. Nobody wanted to call themselves that. And indeed, he was not an atheist. If you think God is nature, you don't believe God doesn't exist. At least if you follow me. Because nature and God are the same thing. And nature exists, nature is God. That's his manner of thinking. So it was a little bit more respectable than being an atheist, but not nearly so respectable as being an agnostic. So he's much more on the radical end of the spectrum than our friend Huxley. Okay, now, I've given you all of these various movements and isms and background movements and so forth to help you understand the context in which Darwin's Origin of Species was conceived and written by Darwin himself. It does not live in a vacuum. And also to understand how the world that first encountered his book perceived it, because of all the things that were going on in their day. Okay? But I don't want to give you I have to emphasize all these things in order to lay an adequate context to understand Darwin and the Darwinian revolution that followed. But I don't want to give you the false impression that the only things that were happening were things going in the direction of secularism and that religion is constantly giving ground. That would be a false impression. Even though there are lots of movements that have been cropping up that are going in that direction. I've outlined it to you. But one movement was the Victorian evangelicalism movement, which was going, you might say, in the opposite direction. Remember George Combe in Edinburgh with his phrenology and his philosophy of natural laws. He was arguing with a group of Scottish evangelicals who had a very literalist view of how to interpret the Bible and so forth. That did not fit most of what the mainstream people in the Church of England believed. So this was a movement that in many ways was a reaction against a lot of the things that I've been outlining. So instead of thinking that across the 19th century the whole of Britain just got more secular and people became less religious, it's, as reality always is, it's much more complicated than that. Yes, for many people that was the way things were going, for some. But for others, they were becoming what they thought of as being more religious, being more evangelical, and and so forth. So, the evangelicals often did not accept many of these new philosophies and so forth that Darwin was talking about, and were particularly opponents of Kuhn's constitution. They hated vestiges. They were not keen on the biblical scholarship. And many of them didn't like Darwin and his evolutionary theory. Which leads to this final question. Ask yourselves this now. How could, as I mentioned to you in the previous lecture, how could Darwin's theory be so successful in such a short period of time in a religiously conservative world? But today, when there's a billion times more evidence for his theory, many more people seem to think that his theory is controversial or objectionable. This is an interesting paradox. How can this be? Clearly we've got to have something wrong. How could Darwin's book, basically one book, although it has various supporters and they've got their own books too, but how could Darwin and a few supporters convince basically the entire, handful of exceptions, the entire international scientific community and almost all of the educated public that their own view was wrong, that species were not individually created, but that they evolved naturally by natural laws? How could that radical new idea, set of ideas, be successful in a world that was so much more religious on average than our modern world is? Can we give you an answer? But just try to imagine yourself in the shoes of some average Victorian reader sitting in front of your fireplace with your slippers and your dressing gown and your pipe and reading this new book. It's really radical. It goes against everything people used to believe. But a lot of people are talking about it. It's highly regarded. But you believe in God. You're a good Christian. You go to church on Sunday. So how is it that such an average Victorian that we're imagining comes to accept Darwin's book? How can this be? This is a big mystery. Yeah, that's a good idea. Uh-huh.
We also have to look at who's doing the talking and who's making the controversy. And we find that those people will be very sincere and very likely to
Just start with your first remark. Maybe what was it again? Literalism wasn't such a big deal then. Yes, I would agree with that. Literalism wasn't such a big deal, as we've seen with the history of geology, right? With the expansion of the age of the world. This does not lead to a crisis of faith. Stretching the age of the earth was not. Remember, all those geologists were all pious religious men. Many of them were actually clergymen. And discovering that the world was older than they previously thought was not an anti-religious thing to do. And then the same thing had happened in astronomy and so forth. It was for them not a conflict of science and religion. Even though something might be controversial or difficult to accept, they somehow managed to keep both. In other words, for the original readers of Darwin's book, most of them, okay, I'm talking on average, averaging thousands of people's reactions, so you have to understand. I'm not saying everyone was thinking the same, they're not. But these people did not take it as that they had to either accept Darwin's theory of evolution or keep their religion. Clearly, this was not what was going on. Because the reading audience who first received and read and ultimately accepted Darwin's theory were mostly religious. So for them, it was not a case of all or nothing, this or that, one or the other. But they managed in a way that I don't claim I have all the answers, but they somehow melded or mixed the two together in some way. Probably everyone made up their own mind, but in such a way that it did not lead to a crisis of faith for most of those people, because we know from church attendance statistics and so forth that the Victorians did not all suddenly drop their religion after Darwin's book. We know with abundant evidence how successful Darwin's theory was in being received. I'll give you some quotes showing this. Very, very widely accepted by the end of the century. Okay? Faith was totally over on Darwin's theory. But people hadn't abandoned their religion. So they somehow managed to keep both. So the bottom question here, today, when there is modern science, oh my gosh, they have enough evidence for evolution, you can stack it all the way to the moon. It's nothing compared to what they had in Darwin's day. They had a lot of evidence, but not that much compared to today with 150 years of modern science, loads and loads and loads of evidence, absolutely mind-boggling. So today, in our world, we have all this massive amounts of evidence, and yet people constantly refer to Darwin's theory as if it was controversial, in a way they didn't do in the 19th century, when they had so little evidence. So that is the question I have to ask all of you. I don't really know the answer. Maybe there isn't just one answer. But it is, I think, a very striking difference between then and now. Why is it so? Why do so many people think it's controversial now? I suppose, if I was to take a guess, take a stab at it, one thing that seems to have changed is there does seem to be a bit more of this all or nothing thinking now. That you either accept one or the other. You can't have both. Maybe for some people. I don't know. What do you think?
I confused you. I thought last time is controversial. You the whole time talk about it like last time controversial.
Yes.
Then
Okay. The comment is that maybe you mean the process of misinformation on the internet we have nowadays. Well, it's definitely part of it, because the internet is a big part of the world today, and there's loads of misinformation about Darwin and evolution out there. But I don't think that's so much a cause as perhaps a symptom of the issue that we're talking about. That there is such. Now, what I will outline in a later lecture will be the rise of a new evangelical movement in the United States in the early decades of the 20th century, which did not exist in Darwin's day, but which has descendant evangelicalisms that still survive. It's a movement that is still growing, still alive, still evolving. And those people became fierce opponents of several kinds of modern science, including geology and evolution. And it's their descendants who mostly reject evolution today. So the view that one often hears in the media and so forth implies that Darwin's theory has been controversial ever since it came out. The point I want you to remember, if you remember only 2 or 3 things from this entire module, remember this, that the way the history actually happened is not like that. Darwin worked for 20 years on this book, it came out, big fuss, big controversy, people didn't like it, fighting and so forth. But within 15, 20 years, the dust settled, the fight was over. Everybody was accepted, this is true, and it was not debated anymore. Evolution was a fact. From the 1870s or so. And within the scientific community, it's never been disputed or debated again. People have been fighting over the details, of course, constantly. Mechanism, this and that. That's just the way science works. But just like the fact that the Earth rotates around the Sun, and the Sun doesn't go around the Earth, that was sorted, hasn't been debated again. Okay? And the theme of Darwin series is another one of those things. It was sorted and it hasn't been contested since. But you constantly hear in public media that it is. I'm not trying to take to convert you to anything. I'm trying to tell you about the historical facts. This is the way the history unfolded. You can believe whatever you want, I don't care. But that's the way this part of the history of science unfolded. And it's constantly misrepresented in the public media, which is a shame. Because there really shouldn't be any dispute for something as obvious and as big as the Darwinian revolution. It's a big event, it's very public, everybody can see it happening. You can see it in some of the most recent reports that I've given to you so far. So reflect a bit on this paradox that we observe. That something big has changed, and I don't know, maybe you can figure out why better than I can. Please. Now, as you know, probably better than I do, next week is e-learning week. Yeah. I don't know why our university does this. I mean, it's a huge waste of time. They call it, we have to get ready in case there's a war or something. None of you are able to come to the university. We're able to teach you remotely. So we'll sacrifice a whole week to this eventuality every year. It's completely disproportionate, in my opinion. But anyway, so we are forced to do this. I cannot see all of you next week and give you a proper lecture. So what I'm going to try to do, if we succeed in figuring out how to do it, is to try to record a lecture for you, showing slides, but it will just be my audio of me talking, which will be the continuation of the lecture on the origin of species, which I didn't finish last week. If I can get it to work. If I can, I'll try something. I'm supposed to do something for you. But anyway, that will probably be only on one of the 2 days. Okay, so it wasn't going to be 2 lectures scheduled for next week anyway, as we sometimes do. I think some of you are aware that there's a midterm coming, right? Yeah. Yes. I will, of course, provide you with a bit more information via email. Do please check your NUS email, because I push email all, and I read an email that goes to all of you about where the midterm will be held, reminding you what's to be covered. Please, many of you have asked me, what do I need to study? And don't ever ask me the question, what is going to be on the exam? What kind of question is that? Well, question number 1 is, what am I supposed to answer what's going to be on the exam? But, I know this course is probably different from what many of you are used to, which might make you more uncertain and more uneasy than you want to be. If you've paid attention to the lectures, if you've looked over my slides, if you've taken notes, you'll be fine. You need to be able to, I'm not trying to trick you in the exam, that's not the point. I'm not going to pick out some tiny obscure little detailed footnote somewhere that I mentioned once and go, ha! You weren't paying attention there, were you? Gotcha! No, that's not the point. So I'm not trying to catch you out with obscure little details and facts. If you paid attention to the salient points, the main issues, the topics that I have reiterated or repeated and so forth, you paid attention and thought while here, and not just chat on WhatsApp and Facebook or something,
Hey, Keith.
then you'll do fine.
Looking Instagram, let's say, I don't know how to do wrong. Yeah, but I don't know how to do, so you can't
Feel
comment.
the suspense.
You know what? You see your name? You see your name? Okay, you know? I don't think you know.
Maybe. No. The readings are
I also don't know.
intended mostly as a supplement to the lectures. Yes. So, you want to doing the readings though, aren't
B,
you?
is it B?
Okay, now we have to answer your questions. No. The readings are intended as background material and so forth, so you better understand what I'm talking about in the lecture and so forth. So,
Before
from
A.
memory, I don't recall any questions that come
Oh, so some
only
more
from information that you would
Is
have
it just
found
like you
in the
mentioned?
reading. I don't think so. There are 50 questions, there are multiple choice.
Hey guys, I got 1 out of 5.
The ones I showed you here, the sample ones, are similar. Just
Yeah,
almost all
probability.
to our 50%
Actually,
chance. You
wait,
would guess
hold on.
what you think all of those. Well, I'm not giving you ones like that in the midterm. They all have at least A, B, C, D, E options, and some of them have multiple things you have to choose. So, for example, you might have to say, well, if that's true, that's true, that's true, that's false, and then color in the box. That's it. So you bring a pencil, fill in your matric number, and you circle lots of circles. So I reckon that for most of you, it should take about an hour. Some of you will want to take longer because, of course, I'm being so generous and allowing this to be open. What do we call it? Open note? Open book? What does open book mean? It means you can bring your notes or anything you
Is it
print
open
out,
book?
but no electronic devices, no
It's open
Googling or
book.
anything like that. You think I'm crazy? your notes, what you have written and recorded and so forth, that you may bring with you, but not anything else. And no, I mean, you can't bring a stack of books or anything. Keep in mind, not allowed. So your notes are printouts. Okay? So I hope you have a better understanding. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Any questions?